Ever since I bought that farm, I had no idea what I was going to face there. The farm was located in a remote area, surrounded by forests on all sides, and I thought this isolation was just what I needed to get away from the noise of the city. The place seemed peaceful and relaxing, and life there was simple. But it wasn't a natural kind of quiet. The first few days felt like a simple adjustment period, but soon, I started feeling something strange. Every night, as midnight approached, something would happen. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe the effect of being alone. But over time, it became clearer and more terrifying. Initially, it was the sounds that caught my attention. Strange noises came from within the farm. Odd rustling sounds underground, as if someone were crawling or knocking on the walls. The sounds came from the abandoned rooms in the old house. I would go to check, but I found nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe rodents, but as the days passed, things began to change. Then I started noticing something more mysterious. Shadows moving in the corners, blurry shapes appearing out of nowhere. They would show up unexpectedly, disappearing before I could get a good look. At first, I thought it was all in my head, but after a while, I began to see those shadows more clearly. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the same noise from upstairs. It was very distinct, like someone running through the abandoned hallways. When I went up to check, there was no one there. Everything was silent, and I even started to doubt myself. Was I hearing things that weren't there? Then came that night, and it was entirely different. The clock struck midnight, and the wind howled outside, but something else was happening, something I couldn't quite identify. A faint light appeared through the old windows, a pale white glow, as if something was watching me from a distance. I started feeling something strange observing me, a feeling I can't describe. I wasn't alone on that farm, yet I felt as though I was in complete isolation, as if the place itself was breathing with me. At that moment, I began to believe that something strange was happening here. What was happening wasn't just a series of coincidences. It was something deeper and more dangerous. At the time, I didn't realize that the shadows I'd begun seeing, the sounds that were following me, weren't just figments of my imagination. Something in that farm was waiting for me. Something old and dark, lurking in the shadows. After weeks of strange occurrences on the farm, I started feeling as if something unseen was watching me. Each night, the tension grew worse, doors slamming shut without warning, eerie sounds coming from nowhere, and finally, shadows appearing in dark corners. One night, I decided to stay awake to discover the source of these phenomena. Everything was quiet, but it was nearing midnight, and my eyes were heavy with exhaustion. Suddenly, I sensed something strange in the air. It felt denser, and my eyes focused on a corner of the room. There, in the darkness, I saw something moving slowly. It wasn't an illusion or a reflection. It was a hazy form, resembling a shadow without any clear features. I backed away, but it moved closer, and faint whispers filled the air, as though someone was speaking directly into my ear, though the words were incomprehensible. "Leave go." The voice was faint but full of menace. I felt a heavy weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. Then, as if the entire place were closing in around me, I heard heavy footsteps coming from behind the walls. But no one was there. Nothing. Everything returned to normal, yet I knew in that moment that the farm was not just an abandoned place. There was something living in it, something old watching me. I quickly shut all the windows, and every light in the house stayed on until morning. But it wasn't enough. When daylight finally came, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted in that dark place. It was all real. The night after that, I decided I couldn't continue living in this nightmare. My sense of dread had peaked, as if I was trapped in a circle of madness. Every corner of the farm held something strange, and every whisper grew louder in my mind. But what finally made me decide to leave was one thing: the old door. In a far corner of the farm, there was an old, broken wooden door I hadn't noticed before. It was tightly shut, but I felt a strange pull, urging me to open it, as if something inside was watching me from behind it. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became in my ears. At midnight, as the clock began to chime, I decided to open the door. Its hinges creaked as if years had eaten away at them. With the first step through, I found myself in a narrow, dark hallway. The air was icy, as if the place was deep underground. I hurried down the passage, hearing whispers growing around me, like the voices were multiplying from the walls themselves. As I moved forward, I noticed the ground beneath me was wet. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Everything went silent. I felt movement behind me, and when I turned, something was standing in the darkness. A hazy figure, a dark phantom at the end of the hall. There was no time to think. I just felt something pressing down on me. The whispers grew louder, but this time, the words were clear. "You will not leave." I let out a scream, but the whispers moved faster than I could. I felt something wrapping around my neck, as though invisible hands were choking me. The voices said, "This isn't your farm. You've entered another place." I tried to run, but I felt the space changing. It was no longer the same hallway. The walls were closing in, as if they were swallowing me whole. Terror gripped me, and every step I took brought me back to the same spot. Everything on the farm seemed to be blending together, as if it clung to me. I finally realized I was trapped. In that moment, I had no choice but to escape. I returned to the door, but when I opened it, I found myself right back where I'd started, as if I hadn't moved at all. I couldn't take it any longer. At dawn the next day, I packed my belongings and decided to sell the farm. I didn't care who bought it or what happened to it. The only thing I wanted was to get away. After I sold the farm, I thought I had left everything behind. But sometime later, I received a phone call from the new owner. He spoke in a tense voice. "Did you leave the old door open?" The farm I lived on was located in a remote area, far from the city and away from people's eyes. I had inherited it from my grandfather, and I decided to live there after growing tired of the noise of urban life. The place was very quiet, but this quiet created a kind of isolation filled with mystery. At first, the farm life went smoothly. I'd wake up early in the morning, tend to the livestock, and fix anything that needed repairs. I loved this simple routine, but on that night, something was different. Something made me feel like everything was about to turn upside down. It was well past midnight. I was in my house, sitting in the living room, looking over some farm documents with the sound of the wind howling outside. Everything was so quiet that I felt something unusual in the air. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound coming from the field behind the house. It sounded like footsteps on the muddy ground. Not the sound of an animal, but that of a person walking. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Still, my sense of unease grew. I realized that the sound wasn't coming from the wind or rodents. I felt there was someone out there in the darkness, moving stealthily in the wide field behind the farm. I hesitated for a moment, but something seemed to urge me to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside quietly. The night was pitch black, and the cold air whipped against my face. I walked slowly along the narrow path that separated the farm from the field, but by then, the sound had stopped. I could hear my own breathing, and the closer I got to the field, the faster my heart raced. I reached the edge of the property, but there was nothing there. No one. I took a step back and felt something strange in the air. The sky was clear, yet I felt like I was being watched. It was hard to explain, but it felt like I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I sensed something moving behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Still, I was certain I had heard footsteps, and they were getting closer. I shone my flashlight with a trembling hand, but as I swept the light across the field, I couldn't see anything. Then, just as I was about to head back to the house, I saw something unusual. In the distance, there was a figure standing at the edge of the farm. It was too dark to make out any details, but they were watching me. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. I thought to myself, maybe it's one of the workers or someone who got lost, but this person didn't move. They just stood there, as if waiting for something. I started to quickly make my way back to the house, but suddenly, this figure moved toward the barn. They moved with an eerie lightness, as if their steps made no sound at all. In that moment, I realized that something wasn't right, and that this person wasn't a passerby or even a butcher stopping by. I went inside and locked the door quickly. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing to find an explanation for what had happened. I didn't know who this person was or what they wanted, but I was certain they weren't there for any good reason. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched the windows and listened for any movement outside the house. But nothing happened after that, and everything remained unsettlingly quiet. The next night, I made a decision not to give in to the fear that had started taking over me. I was ready to face anyone who dared to break into my farm, no matter who or what it was. After what had happened the night before, I knew that this person wasn't just an ordinary thief. There was something strange about his behavior, but I needed to confirm what was happening, and I had to be cautious. That night, I prepared myself. I locked the doors and windows tightly and made sure everything in the house was in its place. Even though the wind was howling outside, I felt something strange in the air, as if the darkness itself was watching me. I sat in the living room, watching every corner, alert for any movement. A few hours passed, and the quiet that surrounded the farm hid something unnatural. Then, around midnight, I began hearing strange sounds coming from outside. At first, they were just distant whispers, as if the wind was carrying incomprehensible voices. But soon, these sounds turned into faint footsteps, as if someone was cautiously approaching the back door. My heart was racing. This wasn't just something passing by. It was the same person I'd feared would return. In that moment, I knew I had to be ready to face anything, no matter how terrifying. I whispered to myself, I won't be a victim this time. I went quietly to the back window and carefully opened the curtains. Darkness covered everything, but I could make out something strange. There was a figure, hiding among the trees in the back field, watching the house. I couldn't see his face clearly, but it was obvious he was waiting for the right moment to break in. I couldn't bear the thought of it any longer. I quickly went to the back door and opened it cautiously, watching the shadow moving slowly in the distance. I began watching him approach closer and closer. He wore dark clothing and moved quietly, as if planning to steal something and escape quickly. I decided I wouldn't let him get inside. Quietly, I closed the door behind me and began sneaking toward the back field. Darkness surrounded the area, and the wind blew with a tension that filled the atmosphere. I knew that if I got close enough, he might feel my presence, and I could lose control of the situation. As I approached the field, I stopped hearing any sounds. The person suddenly paused, as if he'd sensed something. I could see a section of the field in front of me, and the shadow moved slowly in the darkness, as if watching me carefully. At that moment, I decided to confront him. I shouted at the top of my lungs, "What are you doing here?" The silence that followed was the most terrifying moment of my life. But what happened next was too fast for me to process. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move toward the back door of the farmhouse. Without thinking, I ran after him. My feet raced with my heartbeat, and the ground beneath me felt unsteady. I ran as fast as I could, almost tripping, but I could still see him in the darkness, running swiftly as if this place was his playground, knowing every corner and every path. The distance between us closed quickly. I was about to reach him when suddenly, he dashed to the right side of the field and vanished into the darkness. I felt I was just about to catch him, but when I reached the spot where he'd disappeared, there was no trace of him. The place was completely empty. I paused, catching my breath. It was strange. Where had he gone? Had he vanished into the darkness? I knew he couldn't have outrun me. It was impossible for him to disappear at that moment. Then, I heard whispers coming from somewhere far off, as if calling out to me. The whispers were clearer this time, and the words echoed in my mind. "You won't escape. You won't escape. You won't escape." A heavy feeling pressed on my chest, and my eyes darted around the shadows in the field. I was searching for any sign, but everything was completely dark. I tried to find my way back, but I couldn't figure out the right direction. The darkness seemed to grow around me. At that moment, something I didn't expect happened. As I turned around, I felt something touch my shoulder. I whipped around quickly, but no one was there. Yet the person had disappeared completely, as if the ground had swallowed him. But when I returned to the farm, I saw something strange on the ground near the back door. There were deep, muddy footprints, as if someone had been running, but then suddenly stopped. This wasn't just an ordinary person. I knew now that I was dealing with something more than just a passing thief. There was something dark, something inexplicable, and I wasn't sure it was even human at all. After the terrifying incident in the field, I was in a state of shock. It felt like I couldn't escape the nightmare forming around me in every corner of the farm. What initially seemed like a simple burglary attempt had turned into something much bigger, something mysterious that I couldn't explain. But I still held onto a glimmer of hope, believing the only solution was to ask for help. That night, the wind howled through the farm like never before. The sounds outside carried an eerie whispering, as if warning me that I was about to face something unbearable. Finally, I decided to call the police. It was time to get help from professionals. I made the call and told them everything that had happened. The strange person who trespassed on the farm, the footsteps I'd heard at night, the mysterious whispers, and that inexplicable disappearance. The call was short, but they promised to send an officer to investigate. When I told the officer about the strange shadows in the field and the unfamiliar sounds, it felt as though I was describing something unreal. "We'll send someone to check things out, but we need you to stay calm. We're here to help." The officer's voice was steady, though there was a hint of caution. It took them a while to arrive, and I stayed in the house, incredibly tense, unable to sit still or focus on anything. My mind kept circling back to what had happened, to the person who vanished into the darkness, and to those unsettling whispers that had started filling my head. If this had only been a robbery, why did it feel like something much more? Finally, they arrived. The police car's lights illuminated the road in the darkness, and two officers approached me. One seemed to be in his 40s, while the other was a young man in his early 20s. I tried to remain calm, though my heart was racing. "Hello? We're here to investigate the incident you reported." The older officer extended his hand for a handshake. "Can you show us where you saw this person?" I led them to the field where I'd first seen the shadow. I pointed out the place where the footsteps had stopped and showed them the tracks left on the ground. The older officer nodded, appearing to try to make sense of it all. "These are deep, muddy footprints, but," he said, touching the ground, "it's strange that they stop so suddenly. It seems like he disappeared right here." The officer began inspecting the surrounding area. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you see anything else besides these footprints?" "Nothing," I answered, feeling something odd within me. But when I tried to follow him, he vanished. I didn't hear his footsteps as he ran, but he was moving so fast. The younger officer took some photos of the tracks and the shadows cast by the trees in the dark, then began talking quietly with the older officer. Anxiety crept into me, and doubts began to cloud my mind. Did they actually believe me, or was I just someone letting fear get the best of him? Suddenly, the older officer knelt down to examine something on the ground. He was touching something invisible at first, and then he looked at me, saying, "These are other footprints, but they're not human." His voice was low, and I was sure I hadn't heard him right. I quickly stepped closer and looked at the area he was focusing on. There were tracks on the ground, but what made me shudder was that they resembled animal prints. Only they were unusually large, much larger than any human foot. "What are these?" I asked, feeling my heart pound. The officer replied, trying to stay composed, "These aren't tracks from any known animal. Could be something else. But we need to investigate further." Despite the officer's reassurance, a strange feeling hung over the place. There was something in the air that made me feel like the farm was more than just an abandoned place, that it held a buried secret. The officers decided to search the entire farm, especially the darker places like attics and cellars, to check for any additional clues. While they were searching inside the house, I started hearing new whispers, this time clearer, almost human, but the words were incomprehensible. The older officer approached me and asked, Did you hear something? His face was serious. I nodded, but I couldn't say much more. Yes, there's something in the walls. There are whispers. The officer began inspecting the walls carefully but found nothing unusual. He told me calmly, this is normal. It could be air leaks or perhaps just rodents. There's no need to worry, but I knew this wasn't normal. There were other forces in this place, surrounding me, and I couldn't escape them. After hours of searching, the older officer informed me that they hadn't been able to find anything else. We'll keep in touch. If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call us. But in that moment, I felt something more than just fear. I felt like they didn't understand that something bigger than just a robbery was happening here. I was certain that the farm was hiding something dark, something I shouldn't be a part of. This is where part 3 ends. But what did the officer's discovery mean? Were these just animal tracks? Or was there something more behind the strange events on the farm?